I'm Brian Douglas, also known as B Dougie on GitHub, and I am a developer advocate here on the developer relations team. So I like to practice what I call conference-driven development. So I actually pick ideas of things I would like to learn, and then I will, very similar to like the scientific method where you have like a hypothesis first. I'll come up with a hypothesis and then an abstract of what I think it might look like, and I'll submit it as is. And if I get it accepted the first time, then that usually is a good inclination that I kind of hit the nail on the head right away. If I get declined, that's a good inclination for me to go back to the drawing board, to do more research and try to figure out if the conference organizers will actually accept it in the future. I do recommend going to conferences before pitching. I also recommend going, like watching conferences. Nowadays, everything's on YouTube, everything's on Confreaks or another sort of publication to have conference video out there. So watch a few conferences and try to figure out what speakers you like watching, what talks you like, you would actually go and see, you would go seek out. And I wouldn't say I copy those speakers, but take cues and ideas from those speakers to figure out like what they are doing good and see if you can replicate that in your talk, especially if you're a new speaker. So I usually once a year, I'll come up with about 15 ideas of like technologies I would like to get into, technologies I should be into, that help support my career and this excitement about development. So usually I'll just pick an idea and then I'll just either attach it to an existing project that I've already built. So there's a project I build every year that tells me when there's a baseball game happening in the city. So that way I can avoid baseball in San Francisco. And it's a very helpful app because I can reuse that app to test out new technologies like serverless and Docker and cloud storage. And I just leverage those technologies in this application. And then from that point, if I add a new feature, it usually will be packaged up into either a talk or a blog post as well. And I do recommend writing a blog post first, so that way you can also get your ideas out there and see what sort of feedback you get in the comments or in interactions on Twitter. So I usually follow through with my scientific method, ideas, abstract, get that written, and then I sort of like take a zoom out, and we'll take a look at what the content I have and see if there's any parallels in my life and things that I'm interested in. And a lot of times what it looks like is I've watched a documentary on something very recently, and that documentary will then attach itself to the talk I'm trying to give. So I didn't watch the documentary for a previous talk, but it was the Netflix TV show, The Get Down. And that Get Down is what inspired a series of talks around design and development and how Kanye sort of navigated its way into my talk and the culture and the story of my talk. There's a couple speakers that I really admire. I think Kelsey Hightower is one I highly respect his approach to live coding. Live coding is something very challenging to do. I've done it a few times and failed a lot. But I think I've learned every single time I tried to do some live coding, I learned how much preparation that goes into that. So I determined my own style just by giving talks. I noticed that my talks were very similar to like what I did when I was in school or college, public speaking. They were very, point 1, point 2, point 3, and they didn't have much like of me into it. So I started like doing some really internal searching of like what sort of speaker I wanted to be. And I'm naturally witty and I naturally tell jokes off the cuff that I just thought of like within like the seconds of speaking. So I like to do that. So I always try to prepare a couple dad jokes to kind of warm myself up. And then I also like to essentially just be a comedian on stage. And I know the comedy is not for everybody. Not everybody's a comedian, but I've really navigated for myself to be a comedian on stage. So I like to follow the cadence of like comedy and how when a comedian will start with one story and finish an entire set with the same story and kind of loop it all in. So I like those approaches. So I gave a talk at the SFHTML meetup here in San Francisco. And I give a talk about the history of web and how we got to where we are today. So front-end infrastructure, back-end infrastructure, and how they married together with all these Docker containers and cloud. I paralleled it with the story I actually learned from This American Life about the gentleman pirate. SFHTML has a pirate night, Talk Like a Pirate Day, every year. So because of that and the anticipation of that happening within a few months, I gave a talk all about pirates. And I started my talk about a story about how the gentleman pirate actually came to being and how he just did not like his life. And I navigated that entire story. I dropped snippets of his story and his life throughout my entire talk and paralleled it in a way that made sense of how what the gentleman pirate really sought out to do was just be a pirate, but he was actually a rich pirate and did not have the clout to pillage and steal. But he ended up discovering himself and figuring out he could do that. And then he sort of went full circle and actually became a real pirate right before he was met to his death. I talked about that whole circle of his story in the same way how the web was built on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Well, maybe this HTML and JavaScript, and now we're back to that same sort of way, where frameworks are mainly the big frameworks like WordPress and Ruby on Rails are taking up too much of our space in our apps, and now people are more focused on progressive web apps and how HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is really at the core of what you need to do. So forget all the hefty boilerplates. So that parallel, I think, really went well, and I do encourage you to check that out if you have time. So I prepare giving talks. One, I try to get as early as often after it's getting accepted is get my outline written somewhere. The hardest thing to do is understand like what you're going to talk about, and it's a lot easier to share outlines with other people and get ideas and feedback really quickly in like a digestible way. So I usually try to do that earlier on, and then I'll just do all my research. Usually I use Trello to save a bunch of links, tutorials, screencasts, things that would help me develop my talk. So as I'm just normally on the internet, on Hacker News or whatnot, I'm always storing information on the talk I have to give. Usually at this point, it's usually around a month out. When I first started, it was way earlier, but then I'll start collecting information, putting them in Keynote slides as placeholders. And I just set up a bunch of placeholders of how the outline will flow. And once I get closer to the talk, I'll actually put real content in real slides. And that's the point where I actually start looking for that documentary or the story that might come out of this. And I don't successfully always have a story for it, but I always aim to have a story or something to really bring the listeners excited about what I'm talking about. I practice pretty much every single one of my talks with my partner, who's my wife, and she is not technical, but she enjoys a good story. So if I can tell her something interesting and she's not bored or tells me to stop or fix it, and I know at least the story part is good. I think as a speaker, I think you're doing a disservice if someone paid whatever amount of money to show up and give a talk and you don't give them something else to the table. Because anybody can do what I do to prepare talks, which is look at Hacker News, look up articles and figure out what I am regurgitating from stage. But if you can tie it into a story, well, they'll never forget it and always have that sort of experience of, I learned how to do X or Y because the story of pirates was attached to it, or the story of rap culture was attached to it. Then that way they'll always remember how to do X or Y. So the day of, I always like to get there on time or early. Check in, if I can check in the night before during like the speaker's dinner or the happy hour that happens before the event. I'll try to check in there, ask questions to other speakers, what they're gonna talk about, what they're excited about seeing, where they're coming from. And then usually the day of, I will actually scope out the space, see what the stage looks like, identify if the stage is like a step up, if it's a step down, identify if the mic is a handheld mic or if it's a over-the-ear mic. That makes a big difference for me because I tend to talk a lot with my hands. And if I have a handheld mic, then it's gonna be a little bit different. I always also try to prepare in my head whether or not I can give my slides from my computer or from the computer that's provided by the organizers. That also makes a difference for me because if I have to make changes to my slides, then I know I have a cutoff time. And if I don't have to if I can do changes for my slides, then I know I can actually make changes the day of, for example, if a speaker before me mentions something that I don't have to mention again, then I'll take it out. So that way I can give fresh information for my talk. And I always tend to have way too much information. So if I do have the option of editing my slides till the moment I speak, I delete slides that I don't need to speak about. I tend to try to talk to attendees, try to figure out where the background is, see where they're coming from. If I happen to do a talk on something that's new as like GraphQL, then I'll try to get a gauge of like if there's GraphQL knowledge in the audience, if I've met anybody who might be smarter than me, who might be in the crowd, try to glean some information from them. And then I try to also encourage them to see my talk. So a lot of times I might get stuck as the last talk of the day. It's not as nice because then less people know who you are because you haven't given a talk on stage. But I try to get people to show up in my talk so that way they at least have some sort of personal guarantee that it's going to be a good talk. Because if they can get my personality or at least get to know me a little bit, they might show up because they might not even know what talk they might go to. If I'm the first talk of the day, I always try to make myself available. So I leave my laptop in my bag, I'm walking around, making sure I'm wearing the same shirt or sweater that I wore on stage, so that way people can come and find me and then I can network and find out what they liked about the talk, get feedback the day of. One thing that I don't do, that I do want to add, I learned from Ken C. Dodds, is have a survey as part of your talk. So if you can do like a short URL at the end of your talk, have a survey and this gets people to answer like 1 or 2 questions about your talk and see if there's anything else that you can glean from that and information. It's nice to do that. Questions is something that I don't really enjoy a ton. I don't mind taking questions. I don't mind fielding questions. A lot of times I find a lot of the talks that I give or just research and more of like excited topics that I've learned, so I know a lot of the beginner concepts, I usually defer questions. If I can, I'll just ask people to ask me questions offline. So come up to me after the stage, find me on Twitter. I tend to always have my Twitter handle on my slides, so that way during the talk people can take pictures, they can tweet at me, and then I can actually engage them after the talk if they had any other questions, which I think actually does help a lot to kind of field more questions. Questions from the stage tend to be sort of like a loaded, they're always loaded questions. Some people tend to always have like multiple questions, part ones, part twos, 3-part questions, and those are not usually the best for the audience because you're only engaging with the one person. So rather than just engaging the one person from the stage, it's probably better to have them come up to you after, because that way everybody gets a benefit of being there. I highly recommend practice early, practice often. Practice if you happen to be part of an organization where you can actually give talks. Maybe your school or your classes have organizations where you can give talks. Give talks often enough that you are comfortable on stage or comfortable in front of a mic. You don't always have to feel pressure to give talks on technical topics too, if technical topics are still new to you. I recommend just find something you're really excited about and give a lightning talk on it. A lot of local meetups or organizations are always welcoming to learning new things. So start with something you're very familiar with and then work out the things as you learn. So my approach is pick something that's new for me and learn and become an expert on that just by giving a talk. So my recommendation, definitely practice early and often. Compelling abstracts, now I had to learn this the hard way because I submitted a lot, and I think I had like over 40 declines of talks I submitted, but I also spoke 40 times. So like I had a high number of submissions, and I think what really gets you accepted is solving a problem. Like either presenting a pain point, presenting a failure, because I think most people, what they want to learn that other people are figuring things out, and how did you get to where you are today? So if you happen to be an expert at some sort of API or some sort of technology, they want to know how you got there and how they can potentially be in your shoes. So if you can provide a path to them solving that problem, or you can provide a path of someone else who solved that problem and you can share their story for them on their behalf, that's also another valuable way to do it. I personally like to do the approach of storytelling within my talks. So I like to introduce people. As far as like an arc, I think I break everything up as far as, even when I do blog, it'll be like SCQA, which is, it's a term that actually I don't remember the origin from, but if you Google it, there's a book that a female actually wrote, and it's about convincing people of your technical topic. So I use it a lot as a developer and convincing people in my pull request of how to prove that my code was the right way to write the code. And if it wasn't, then they had enough information to then prove me otherwise. So I use that same sort of SQA philosophy, which is situation, complication, question, and then answer. And I usually start with presenting the problem of how the situation is. So if it's how the modern web is developed, JavaScript, let's talk about JavaScript and HTML and where it came from. And then I'll talk about the complication, like JavaScript's hard. Like, why do you have to NPM everything? A lot of people have JavaScript fatigue. And then I'll present a question, is there a better way? And then my answer is yes, it's the BW way. And then I'll just teach you how to Dougie the entire time. So I originally discovered Code Newbies as soon as its inception, which was on Twitter. And then I stumbled on the Code Newbies just from another nudge from somebody else that I knew of. And I've been a part of that community, and I find that community is really helping and supportive, because there's a lot of individuals like myself who might have had a different degree or a different path to start with and decided maybe that was not their path as career-wise. And I found myself that I did a lot of talking through that, and I found that I enjoyed talking about technical concepts and sort of bringing what was highly technical and maybe not so easy to grasp as a newbie, and bring it to a way where someone can actually understand it with like a story or a different way to explain it. I originally actually was doing sales full-time. I got a finance degree in college. The world decided that finance was not working at the time, so the entire market crashed. So I didn't have a place to kind of entry into finance. So I got a sales job, decided I didn't like that. So I learned how to code on my own. So I did a lot of like self-learning, a lot of teaching myself, a lot of collecting information and preparing, like me learning something new. So that's the same approach mainly I do for conference-driven development. And From that, I ended up getting a job doing Ruby on Rails out in Orlando, Florida, and then eventually found my way in San Francisco at a startup.